Hey everyone, Tactics here, and in this video I wanted to take a look at tanks on the 10.2 PTR and kind of talk about how each spec is looking after we've seen now a few different build iterations. I've been getting a lot of questions over on my Twitch stream, like what's looking to be the meta tank pick in Mythic Plus or raids, what am I personally going to be maining, and the short answer for those questions basically is that it's just too early to say. There's still a ton of bugs, there's some issues, and there's at least a few weeks more of build iterations to come. So personally, I actually haven't decided what I'm going to main in the patch itself. So instead, I'm just going to quickly just give my thoughts here on how each tank spec looks, what issues they're facing, and kind of how they compare. Just be aware, things can change quickly on the PTR, and I will be posting kind of an updated video probably, around the week before the patch launches, once things are a bit more just definitive. So be sure you guys subscribe to the channel and turn notifications so you don't miss that video specifically. Now, I figured a good place to start here is actually going to be Vengeance, a Demon Hunter. So instead of having the classic, B-roll of me playing the spec, I actually want to talk about their talent tree here and kind of show you the specific talents they've got, because they did get their little revamp, rework, whatever you want to call it, in this week specifically. So there are still quite a few, bugs, issues with it. Some things are way too strong, some things don't work at all. So keep that in mind. It's sure to get some changes over the next few weeks. It's just like the first iteration, which introduced that kind of sigil based build for them, which kind of lives on the right side of their spec based tree. This, of course, was expected, as their tier set, for those that don't know here, is kind of based around Sigil of Flame, right? So they're 2-piece here. When you attack a target afflicted by your Sigil of Flame, your damage and healing are increased by 2%, as well as stamina for 8 seconds, cycling up to 5, so up to 10% total. And then the periodic damage has a chance to flare up, shattering an additional soul fragment from a target and dealing additional damage. And each 40 Fury spent reduces its cooldown more, so more CDR there. And something to note, that 4-piece there, it did actually have its chance to flare up on targets beyond the first reduced, just because it was shooting out just so many actual fragments in like Mythic Plus multi-target scenarios, right? So it did have a little bit of a nerf there, so keep that in mind. That did change, but now let's run through some of these nodes, because actually I think the idea of this build is actually pretty interesting for Mythic Plus, and then I think that's where you're getting the kind of the complaints about Vengeance right now, is like their raid options. This sigil build doesn't really feel the greatest, particularly in like single target scenarios. Feels great in Mythic Plus maybe, but for raid it's less so for sure. And some people I've seen, I don't know if this is going to be true by patch launch, I doubt it, but they've been talking about potentially using their Aberrus tier set in a Mirdrasil, despite that 39 eye level gap in a raid scenario, right? Lower target count, fiery brand build type thing, which is definitely something that needs to be addressed, hopefully with buffs to the spec itself in different ways, or different type of build potentially. But let's talk about some of the new talents here. And so basically the idea of this sigil based build is, you're going to try and get, maybe as many sigils as you can, and you're going to get multiple charges. You get 2 charges of every sigil, because if you look down here, illuminated sigils, you get 1 extra charge of all your sigils rather, and you get 20% increased parry against targets affected by your Sigil of Flame. This talent's a bit buggy right now. Sometimes it gives you like additive parry per target hit instead of just against that one target. You get 20% parry, so that's a little weird right now. But the idea here is like your Sigil of Flame is going to be a big thing. You have a bunch of like damage increases to Sigil of Flame there. Sigil of Flame can overlap. There's some stuff over here, more Sigil of Flame damage there. So your Sigil of Flame is going to hit very hard. You're going to get some flat extension on Sigil of Flame here, so a radius increase, duration increase. Precise sigils is going to be very powerful, most likely. Currently, it doesn't work with illuminated sigils, so they're just bugged. You don't get a second charge of your sigils if you play precise sigils right now, but you will likely be playing that once it's fixed, which is maybe a little weird. You're gonna have to play around it being on your target, all your sigils rather. So you're gonna be, having these longer duration effects. You're gonna be able to extend your effects here, because Charred Flesh with your Immolation Aura now also increases your Sigil of Flame, so that's another way you can extend it past that flat extension. You're going to get CDR from your tier set, and you're going to get more CDR here by using Sigil. So you're going to be able to get that Sigil of Flame cooldown specifically relatively low, but also this one affects all of your Sigils. So, you're going to have 2 charges of Elysian Decree, but you're also going to be CDRing your Elysian Decree. You're going to get, you know, if you're running Chisel of Chains, which is now over here in the capstone area, so kind of got the mass grip treatment where it's more accessible, but you have to give up a capstone point. So potentially you do end up grabbing it and you'll get 2 of those, you know, 1-minute CDs. Same with Misery, you know, if you get the Misery CDR, potentially you're going to have a lot of Misery charge. So it's I think it's an interesting idea. For sure. We'll see how it actually ends up going in practice. It's very, very powerful in Mythic Plus right now because of some of those buggy interactions. You know, having 2 Sigil of Silences that will be 10-second silences is going to be kind of crazy for caster lockdown for sure. Now, there are some things about this rework that still don't feel good. I think like the biggest one is like talents like this still exist where you have to path through, which like you really don't care about whatsoever, right? Who cares about 6-second CDR on Throwglaive, really, for the most part, as a Vengeance Demon Hunter? You don't, right? Like, there's a bunch of these nodes here that exist that make the tree kind of feel bad to traverse through still. And there are some good things for sure, right? Like, it's a bunch of 2-point nodes, and I think Vengeance had the most 2-point nodes out of any tank. They've just been straight up removed, right? So these are all like 1-point nodes in the middle here, which super nice for sure. I just really hope maybe they kind of address some of these really kind of lame 1-point nodes. And if you also notice, the capstone kind of got shifted around slightly, as I mentioned, because things like Fodder to the Flame, things like Elysian Decree have been moved over here. So there's some you know, swapping around that has happened. They've gotten kind of the Divine Toll treatment, which is good. Please do that for Druids, I beg. Overall, I think Vengeance is looking pretty decent for Mythic Plus, and I think they need a bit of help for Raid. And I think, you know, the looking decent Mythic Plus thing, I think that's also kind of assuming, you know, some of these like interactions get fixed and like some of these bugs get fixed. I like the idea of the Sigil build. I want to see, you know, how the actual output is going to be once some of these interactions are fully working and that kind of thing, but I'm tentatively hopeful for Mythic Plus, but think the spec does need a little bit of help in a raid environment. Actually, I guess something else in that department, Darkness, because there was a bunch of raid cooldown rather adjustments that happened. So Darkness is now down to a 15% avoid chance in like a raid environment, but it actually gets boosted to 30% in Mythic Plus. So it's worse in raid, but better in Mythic Plus, which potentially is interesting because you can actually, of course, grab it. Not, you know, you're not giving up nothing, but you can get it relatively easily in Mythic Plus for sure. So it'll be interesting to see if that actually gets any play at all as well. But something to keep in mind as well for you know, them, and I believe Warriors is the other one that got hit with the Rallying Cry nerfs, which we'll talk about in a second here. First of all, let's talk Guardian Druid, the current kings of Mythic Plus. So we did see another change there to their own tier bonus. So their 2-piece was buffed. It now absorbs 25% of damage taken, up from 10%, and had the duration increased to 45 seconds from 30 seconds. In general, this is basically aimed to help you actually consume and get the value out of your tier, because before, with the lower value on the lower duration, it was very, very hard to actually use your entire shield before it expires, because, you know, you had things like counter synergies, like with Ursoc's Fury, you know, with that absorb shield being built or used first rather, in lower target counts, you know, Tooth and Claw procs could prevent you from spending enough rage because those didn't contribute to your Rage of the Sleeper extension, and those kind of things just made the tier very, very bad to use and play around. And I still kind of think it's not great, honestly. And again, if you look at the throughput of the actual tier set itself, it's not too hot. It's relatively low percentage. And the other thing is that there's currently a bug with the tier set where it's doing twice as much damage as it's actually supposed to do. All the damage events are ticking twice. So, you know, it's doing like 5 to 8% of your damage with that double damage bug, which is not great. It's definitely not good. So it's really going to do half that, and you know you don't get to build up a really big shield in single target. It kind of feels weird to play around. The funny thing is the recent Blood Frenzy nerf that happened as well, where your rage generation is now capped at 5 targets. It actually makes the tier set look better in Mythic Plus, because it has less of that counter synergy that I mentioned with Ursoc's Fury, because you have less rage that you're generating, so you're raising less, which means you're building less Ursoc's Fury shield, which means the tier set shield looks nicer because the counter synergy is less, right? So it's a little funny how that worked out. I do think the biggest problems for Bear right now outside the tier set are actually their rage generation issues. I think, you know, they're losing 15% rage generation flat from their current tier. Obviously, Blood Frenzy got nerfed pretty heavily. And I think particularly in lower target counts is where this needs to get looked at. Maybe some generation buffs to, things like Mangle or Thrash as baseline on single target to help increase that. Maybe, I think potentially the nerf to Blood Frenzy was like a little harsh, but something you could do to help with lower target count scenarios is bump it up to 3 rage per target, keeping it at a 5 cap, or if you just want to keep it good in AoE, you could increase the cap to 8 and leave it at 2, something like that. I think the rage flow of the spec just feels way, way, way worse. And I think this is where we're starting to get into the issue of this spec had an insane tier set. It's losing that insane tier set for probably maybe the worst tank tier set currently in the next patch. And, I think the spec got a tiny bit over nerfed on the baseline side of things where they probably should have aimed at the tier set. Because, again, just like Vengeance Demon Hunter that we just mentioned, some Guardians are potentially considering the benefits of wearing their Aberrus tier in raid progression in a Mirdrasil. Again, 39 eye level gap there potentially on the high end. And, it's still not totally out of the question, which kind of indicates an issue on the Guardian Druid side. So hopefully, again, just like Vengeance, instead of just nerfing the old tier, something needs to be looked at with the base spec, with the talents, with the current tier, or with a brand new tier set rather, to make it so that that doesn't seem appealing, right? Because 39 eye levels alone should make it enough, but it's not. And so why is that an issue? That's what needs to be addressed for these two tank specs. So hopefully that it is. One thing I want to mention about the 4-piece, I really dislike, again, how I mentioned that counter synergy, especially in lower target counts with Tooth and Claw. We're using that Tooth and Claw maul in a global where you have such limited globals in your Rage of the Sleeper window to actually get your extension feels very bad. And so I think really they should just make the 4-piece be a flat 5-second extension on Rage of the Sleeper. I don't think it would be terribly OP. I don't think you should really need to have to do extra work to kind of get that, and it eliminates that entire counter synergy with Tooth and Claw without really, like, it's very simple, right? It's very simple to do it in that way, as opposed to some maybe workaround way where it's like, oh, how do you make Tooth and Claw mauls count? I don't know. I'm not a developer, right? I don't know how much more difficult that would be than just giving us the 5-second extension. I don't think it would be terribly overpowered anyway. So hopefully do that, hopefully address some of the rage generation issues in lower target counts, and I think Bears would be pretty happy. Moving on, we have Protection Warriors, who saw a recent kind of adjustment to their own tier set where it was nerfed offensively but buffed defensively. So now it deals 40% of the bleed damage instead of 100%, but it gives you a 10% DR on yourself instead of the mob, and the CDR on Thunderous Roar has gone up to 3 seconds instead of 1 second. So more CDR, little bit less damage, single target priority damage, whatever, but you get a DR on yourself. So it's just a flat DR, which is very, very nice to see. I will say it does feel a little bit weird because you're actually losing out on Thunderous Roar damage in like low, like single target count scenarios, for example, because you shield slam it off your target and you're only getting 40% of the bleed damage. So it's not like you're going to make the choice to stop shield slamming in a single target scenario, right? Don't use your procs, that kind of thing. So it feels kind of weird, right? It feels like something that shouldn't exist because you can't just instantly reapply Thunderous Roar like your other two bleed effects. So potentially maybe make that 2-piece damage 100% of specifically just Thunderous Roar as an example. Maybe just make it not consume Thunderous Roar, whatever you want to do. I think just to make that feel a little bit better with the interaction with Thunderous Roar, or just not have an interaction with it, because it just feels weird for sure. The other big thing for Warriors was a pretty significant nerf to Rally. You don't get the Inspiring Presence buff to Rally anymore, and Rally is basically just down to a 10% 10-second long buff, right? So it's got a pretty significant nerf there. It doesn't have kind of a dungeon amp like Darkness has either, so not too great feeling for the Warriors out there, of course. But I will say, I think all the buffs over the course of patch 10.1 have felt pretty good. I think Warrior is a sleeper tank spec right now. I think people are underrating it. I think this tier set gives them still a significant amount of single target and priority target damage, even after the nerfs. Thunderous Roar cooldown is pretty real now, for sure. You get the self-tankiness just in general instead of on one mob. I think Warrior is kind of like my sleeper pick right now for like an underrated, very powerful tank. Maybe they're not going to be meta, but they're going to be very, very good. So Warrior players out there, you gotta be feeling happy, I think, going into patch 10.2 for sure. That brings us to Brewmaster Monk, who have had a ton of bugs in their tier set, actually. You know, like initially, I think their 2-piece was doing some crazy things. Their 4-piece just wasn't working. I think currently, though, they are one of the tank specs where all the bugs that exist in the game, in the PTR game right now, are positive. So the tier is feeling better than it should be, is my understanding. You know, so keep that in mind. That being said, Brewmaster feels real good. Brewmaster is probably the best this spec has felt in the entire expansion, right? They've had the over the course of the last couple patches, right, they've addressed some of the button bloat a little bit. You have some other options there, and then with the extra leech you're getting with your tier set, as well as the additional shielding on your own stagger, it feels really, really good. You feel quite tanky. Much tankier than you have in the past, I think, as a Brewmaster Monk. And while the tier set isn't great on the damage side of things, it's just kind of okay. I think Brewmasters really haven't struggled in the damage department, right? They've been the big damage AoE tank kind of throughout the expansion, and so they're not unhappy with a set that's pretty much heavily focused on the defensive side of things. So I would say Brewmasters are looking quite good. Again, there's not too much to say here. Basically, their tier set, my understanding is it's doing more healing and more damage than it should be right now. I'm not exactly sure how much, but just at least a bit more. So kind of waiting to see when those bugs get fixed to do some more in-depth testing. But I think Brewmasters are also in a feeling pretty good kind of situation. Of course, they also bring that powerful monk utility, which is always really nice in a Mythic Plus environment, monk debuff in a raid environment, though that's kind of more dependent on how the other monk specs are doing, though I know Mistweaver's doing pretty decent. Potentially Woundwalker's not doing too hot, so you'll have to see on that end. But overall, I think Brewmasters, this is probably hoping that the tier doesn't get slammed down too hard with the bug fixes. I think this is probably going to be the best Brewmaster has felt all expansion. So again, kind of in the same boat as Proutware, really nice to see, and Brewmaster's got to be feeling pretty happy about it. Next up, let's take a look at Blood DK. They've actually seen the least changes over the course of the last few weeks of PTR since I last talked about tanks. Basically, the one big change they did get is that their tier now procs off of runic power spent instead of bone shield charges consumed, which is really good, right? The old issue is that basically, if you're not actively tanking a boss, like in a raid environment, and you don't have many ways to consume bone shield charges, you're just not going to get tier procs, right? Again, kind of a similar issue Guardian faces right now. If you're not tanking something, you're not using your shield, but we've talked about Guardian. Back to Blood DK, it's much nicer now because it's now just based on using your Death Strike, that kind of thing, spending that runic power, and so you're going to be able to get those procs, and about 1.5 procs per minute based on my testing, whenever you get them, right? It's not going to depend on you having to tank something. You can just constantly get those procs. That being said, I think in a Mythic Plus situation, potentially this is not exactly what they needed. It's going to do wonders on pulls which you open up with A-Bomb Limb, right? That's going to help you a lot because you're going to instantly kind of spread your Ashen Decay with A-Bomb Limb, which is really nice for that initial kind of thing to help you survive grouping a pull when you have A-Bombs Limb. But that's not always going to be the case, right? There's going to be a lot of situations where you don't have your A-Bombs Limb on the start of a pull, and that's just going to be just like before, right? It's like you're not going to have some basic initial way right off the top of pulls to survive, because that's usually when DKs are kind of in the most danger, right? In a raid environment, though, I think Blood DK is looking to be pretty nice. The assumption here is that they are going to be using a Soul Reaper build. They're obviously going to get that Legendary Axe, which we don't know anything about yet, so that could also push them over the edge depending on how long that takes to actually acquire. You're in a mid-tier CE guild, for example, and you're able to get the Legendary Axe before you've gotten your CE, that could be a massive power boost as an example. But I think in single target situations, Blood DK is going to be looking much better than they are currently, because they're going to be able to have 100% uptime in execute phase on their damage buff, right? With that Soul Reaper kind of maintaining their Ashen Decay, which is going to be really nice. Just flat 20% damage, 10% DR at all times, sub 35% on the boss is not to be scoffed at, right? That is a very powerful bonus because, again, execute phases in progression rating tend to be the most important usually, right, not always, but usually this is pretty significant, and any additional bit of damage you can squeak out in those phases is important. And if, Blood DK is the top 1 or 2 damage in Execute, because of course, Prot Warrior is probably up there as well, as they also have access to an Execute. But if Blood DK is up there with Prot Warriors in an Execute phase in terms of damage, there's a good chance that is important for progression, right? So I don't think, I guess this is kind of the opposite of some of the other tanks we've talked about, where I don't think Blood DKs in a raid environment are going to be too upset about this, especially with that Runic Power Spent change versus Bone Shield charges consumed. But I think probably Mythic Plus DKs we're kind of hoping for something that would help them out a little bit more, just to survive those initial kind of one-shots or grouping of packs, that kind of thing. Because that's really where Blood DK kind of struggles in high keys, is again, those grouping of packs. And A-Bombs Limb with the tier does help with that, but that is it, right? So that's, if you don't have A-Bombs Limb, you're not going to have that help. And so there's a little bit there, but it's probably not as much as people wanted. But again, you're getting a legendary 200 axe. Maybe that helps you out. Maybe that pushes your damage so high over the edge that it's like Blood DK is by far the best DPS. Very possible, right? We don't know what the effect is. So I would, hold on to that, to the fact that you're getting a legendary for sure. So again, Blood DKs, like you're going to see here kind of across the board, it's not 100% what they wanted, but I think you can't be feeling too bad because, again, pretty solid in a raid environment, I think, and you're getting a legendary, so you don't know how that can swing the table in your favor, how much that's going to be an impact on things like the meta, right? Last but not least, we have Protection Paladin, who's seen a pretty significant buff to their tier set bonus in the recent weeks. So basically what's happened is it now grants a flat damage reduction at 2% per stack instead of armor, and your empowered consecrate now occurs at 5 uses of judgment, so 5 stacks instead of 10. If that weren't enough, they're 4-piece, so the chance to deal additional damage as fire is now 40% damage instead of 20%. So the output, both offensively and defensively, has been drastically increased. It's now very high, actually. It's still annoying to play around sometimes, right? You still have to play around your consecrate. You still have to build up that empowered consecrate. It still feels terrible if, something happens that causes you to move out of that empowered consecrate. But the time it takes to build an empowered consecrate, basically being cut in half down to around 15 seconds, makes it feel not as bad to play around. I'm not gonna lie, it still sucks to have a tier set based around consecrate, right? But if you look at the output of this tier set, it is up there at the top with the tanks right now. And that is a really, really nice swing for Prot Paladins, going from having easily the worst tank tier set in 10-1 to close to maybe arguably the best tank tier set in 10-2, despite it being annoying to play around. Now, I know it being annoying to play around is upsetting for a lot of players, is, a turnoff for a lot of players, which is 100% fair, but I just wanted to point out that the actual benefits that you're getting for using it are actually quite high. So while you're not necessarily going to get the max benefit of this, that's unrealistic, because no matter what you do, you're likely going to have to move out of your empowered consecrate, clip your empowered consecrate or whatever at some point. It's not as bad because the actual building to that empowered consecrate has been significantly reduced time-wise. Again, I do think this would be better if they found a way to tie this empowerment to the Paladin instead of to the consecrate you put on the ground. I don't know, what that entails. I think that would feel better, but maybe that's not possible. And I would also love if maybe the animation for your empowered consecrate was a little bit different, a little bit more obvious just visually, that, hey, I just threw down an empowered consecrate, right? Like, maybe make it shadow flamey, or if you want to reuse stuff like the Ashen Hollow textures are like right there, right? You could just make it look like a little mini Ashen Hollow, just to make it very obvious in game without the need of like a weak aura to kind of show, hey, this consecrate you just put down is good, don't leave it, right? There are also some bugs with the empowered consecrate, I believe. I didn't actually test this week if they existed, but some of the outer edges of the extended length of the empowered consecrate didn't actually work for some consecration bonuses, but I assume again that will be fixed before this goes live, because that seems like something that's kind of important. But yeah, so overall, Paladins, again, not happy with how the set bonus really plays fully, but it's a very powerful set bonus, and it makes it a lot easier with, again, the reduced in build time, and basically increased uptime on the Empowered Consecrate to kind of line it up with your CDs to get even more damage benefit out of that 4-piece. So it's not as bad to play around. Still feels bad a little bit for sure. And, you know, again, maybe something like tying the buff to the Paladin, if they can do that, would make it feel a lot better for sure. But there we have it, guys. My thoughts on how tanks are currently looking on the 10-2 PTR. I will say overall, tanks are feeling a lot closer kind of across the board than they did last patch, which is always good to see. And hopefully we see a lot of those bugs and issues that tanks are dealing with dealt with by, you know, the devs or whatever before patch 10-2 launches. Remember, I do all of my tank testing on the PTR over on my Twitch stream at Tactics, so be sure to stop by and say hi. You know, Mythic Raid testing every week on like Thursdays and Fridays, dungeons over the weekend, lots of stuff. So, you know, be sure to come by for sure. Of course, I have to give a massive thank you over to my supporters on Patreon. Could not do any of this without you, so thank you, and I will see everyone in the next video.